Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Rain fell in Succa the evening Evelyn first understood that love can be both a soft pillow and a stone in the shoe, and the sky wore the color of brewed tea, heavy and thinking. She had walked the red earth road with Daniel since childhood, their laughter skipping like stones across the shallow stream behind her mother's compound, but now everything felt different, like a drumbeat heard through a wall. News of her swelling belly had slipped from her like a pigeon startled from a bowl of Gary. Once said, it flew in widening circles. Neighbors' eyes grew long, aunties' tongues sharpened, and even the mango trees seemed to hum with gossip. Her mother's sigh was an old one, smelling of palm oil and patience. Her father's silence was the kind that gathers like harmattan dust under the bed, thick and choking if stirred. Daniel stood his ground, saying with a chest that he would not run, that even if the Anambra River turned to dust he would still find water for them. Words are sweet until a man must chew them. He had only his hands, his promise, and a fishing net that came back more tired than full. Yet the two of them still stole quiet moments by the cracked wall of St. Nicholas, where the vine wound itself like a secret, and they whispered futures into each other's palms, tracing lines as if prophecy lay in skin. The night the test confirmed what her body had already sung in whispers, she lay on her raffia mat and watched a gecko on the ceiling stalk a moth, a silent hunt that felt like a parable. Sometimes there is no villain, only hunger and a creature that must move. Nsuka carried them on its back, bread sellers calling, kiki horns squabbling, charcoal smoke writing gray poems in the air, while Evelyn counted days and hid smiles that tried to bloom at the oddest hours. When Daniel's mother, stern as a pestle and twice as solid, finally looked at Evelyn without blinking, she said, "A calabash that holds water can hold soup," and the judgment softened into something like reluctant shelter. Still, Evelyn learned that months can be both short and endless. She tucked money into a kerchief, a few crumpled notes smelling of market dust, and she tucked fear under her tongue where it dissolved slowly like aspirin and left the same bitter trace. Each evening, as the sun bled into the hills beyond the old campus, she would sit by the doorway and press her hands to a belly that rose like the tide, and talk to whoever was forming inside. My child, my secret drumbeat, my moon. The women at the well, who measured wisdom by the bucket, told her that labor is a road you walk alone while the whole village listens, and she nodded because some truths are so true they don't need proof, only time. Her time came with rain, rain that drummed on the zinc roof until the house sounded like 1,000 footsteps arriving at once. The midwife from Succa Central wrapped her head in a scarf the color of ripe plantain and said the obvious, which somehow feels like a blessing when you are afraid. You are strong, you are doing well, breathe like the sea. Evelyn tasted iron and salt and the shadows between them. Pain came in waves, carried her out to the dark, set her down, dragged her again. The room smelled of dettle, sweat, and boiled water. Outside, a neighbor's generator coughed like an old man. Between surges she remembered Daniel's hand, broad, calloused from hauling wet nets on the Anambra, a hand that had once lifted a fish that flashed silver as a promise. Now it held hers and did not tremble, though his eyes betrayed the storm. When the baby finally slid into the bright world, the sound she made cut through the rain like a lantern through fog. Martha they named her, because the name fell on them like cool shade, and in the hours that followed, they counted fingers as if numbers could spell safety. The morning broke clean and thin, eggs sizzling in a neighbor's pan, the smell of wet dust rising in praise. Daniel walked the corridors of the clinic with a grin that made strangers smile back. He was a man who had caught a golden fish and intended to keep it. Yet the world, even when it blesses, also calculates. The midwife whispered about iron supplements and the cost of vaccinations. The landlord remembered to knock about that leaking roof. The seamstress asked if Evelyn still wanted the lace taken in. Life's bills queue like buses at Ojalegba. They honk until your head hums. In Succa's sun-flattened afternoons, Evelyn would rock Martha and sing, voice a small canoe on a restless lake, and tell herself that joy is a muscle. If you use it, it grows stronger. Some nights she worried the future like a rosary, bead by bead. Some mornings she simply ate akra dipped in pepper and laughed when Martha's mouth made a small O of surprise at the world's heat. The months turned like pages and did not tear. She learned to patch clothes with patience, to stretch stew with stories, to braid hope into hair so it lay close to the scalp and did not blow away. 2 years teach a woman the shape of her strength and the length of her breath. By the time Martha called Mama, with a voice that had mischief at the edges, Nsuka had become too small for their hunger, and Daniel followed a rumor down to Onitsha, where the Niger moves with the quiet arrogance of a king. On the Onitsha wharf, smell of diesel and river silt, he joined men whose hands were as nicked as church benches, and whose laughter was sharp as a broken bottle's glint. He learned that a good day could taste like EBA and Ogbono, and a bad one tasted like nothing at all. Money trickled instead of flowed, a stingy tap that refused to open wide. Evelyn packed their few things, a quilt of the life they'd stitched, and followed, carrying Martha on her back, her feet measuring the distance between courage and necessity. Onitsha wrapped them in noise, spare parts singing their metallic anthem, hawkers calling prices that rose and fell like a chorus, buses arguing with the road, and yet in their one-room space, they made a small island of calm. Evelyn took washing from neighbors, her fingers whitening from soap until they looked like moons. She sold roasted corn at the corner where the sun drilled heat into the road until it smoked, and she learned the rhythm of the market the way a drummer learns skin. Then life, with the sly smile of a trickster, tightened the knot, a sudden weariness that did not pass, a season when her body felt like a house with too many visitors. When the midwife looked at her and hummed the soft hum of good but complicated news, the word twins fluttered around the room like two butterflies chasing each other. Evelyn smiled with one corner of her mouth and chewed fear with the other. She remembered the price of milk, the price of soap, the price of breathing in a city that charges for everything. She walked the Onitsha evening streets, sunset pouring copper into the gutters, and thought of Nsuka's mango shade, her mother's wrinkled hands, Daniel's stubborn jaw. When she laid down at night, Martha's body warm against her back, she counted again. Rent, rice, kerosene, clinic fees, cloth for wrappers, school later. Could she hold so much without breaking? The question perched on her shoulder like a curious bird and would not fly away. But in the morning, she rose and washed her face and told the mirror the oldest truth. A day has 2 hands. If one hand throws stones, the other hand still waters the garden. The day labor came again. The sky over Onitsha was a pale bowl. The heat had even worn out its own voice. Daniel had gone to Warri for a short job on a boat, chasing a bigger catch, and his absence sat in the room like a chair no one wanted to use. Nurse Clara arrived with the steadiness of a lighthouse, eyes that knew too much and hands that knew what to do. The first baby slid into the world as easily as a secret, a soft girl with a mouth shaped for singing, and the second followed like a twin shadow, perfect and present. 2 pairs of wrists, each bearing a faint crescent birthmark, as if the moon had kissed them before letting them go. For a breath-long hour, joy strutted through the room, bold as a rooster at dawn. Then the arithmetic woke, that harsh teacher. 2 new mouths, 1 Martha, 1 pot, 1 pocket with holes, 1 woman already stitched with tiredness. Fear did not come like thunder. It came like mist, touching everything until the world looked blurred. Clara saw it. She sat on the edge of the bed and spoke like a mother who has learned to measure sentences. Not all sharing is loss. Her voice made a small bridge between a rock and a hard place. She said she could carry 1 child and raise her as her own, not far, not hidden, just sheltered from the storm of hunger that breaks roofs and spirits alike. The clock on the wall ticked, as if it were counting grains of sand in an hourglass no one could flip back. Evelyn held the twins and recognized that love is not only a shout. Sometimes it is a painful dividing that hopes to multiply later. She kissed 1 child, Ruth, and breathed her name like a prayer tied to a kite string. She pressed her cheek to the other, Grace, and felt her heart split, like yam under a sharp knife. The room had 3 women and 3 kinds of silence. The silence before a decision, the silence after a promise, the silence that becomes a shadow and follows. When dawn thinned the night and the city's engines began their grumble, Clara wrapped Grace with the care a weaver gives the last row on a loom, and slipped toward the waking road. Evelyn watched the door close and knew a truth too large for words. Some mornings begin with subtraction and still ask you to add yourself to the day. She lay back, Ruth tucked against her, Martha just stirring, and listened to Onitsha stretch its limbs, the future stepping softly like a cat before a leap. The days that followed Grace's quiet departure with Clara felt like walking through a house where 1 room had been sealed shut. You knew it was there, you could feel the air shift around it, but you never opened the door. In Onitsha, the streets carried on with their noisy breathing, hawkers calling as though each word was a fishing net, engines groaning like old men at dawn. But inside Evelyn's small rented space, time seemed to limp. Ruth, still too small to know she had once shared the warm ocean of a womb, slept with her hands curled near her face, while Martha began to ask questions that wore strange shoes, questions that didn't seem to fit the conversation they were in. Mama, why did Nurse Clara come in the night? Mama, did she take the baby for weighing? Evelyn would answer with the softness of a palm leaf brushing the ground, giving just enough to quiet the moment without feeding the root of curiosity. She learned quickly that children could sense the tremor in an adult's voice the way birds feel the air shift before a storm. Daniel returned from Warri a week later, smelling of river wind and diesel, carrying a small envelope of money that he dropped into Evelyn's lap without ceremony. He did not notice that the room seemed emptier than it should have, or perhaps he noticed, but was a man trained by hardship not to prod wounds whose pain he could not fix. In the market, Evelyn bought yam, dried fish, palm oil, and salt with an efficiency born of knowing exactly how many meals each coin could stretch into. The gossiping women at the next stall, balancing trays of vegetables on their heads, eyed her belly to confirm it was flat again, then turned their conversation to the price of beans. In her quieter hours, Evelyn replayed the moment Clara's hands had taken Grace from hers, not as a single blow but as a slow untying of knots, each one a piece of herself. Yet, she did not regret entirely. Regret is for choices made in abundance, and she had chosen in the tight throat of scarcity. At night, she would look at Ruth's sleeping face and imagine the same face on another bed, under a different roof, hearing lullabies in Clara's low, even tone. That thought cut and soothed in equal measure. Grace was gone, but Grace was loved. And love, however far, was still a kind of presence. The seasons in Onitsha have their own moods. Harmattan's breath turning mornings to cold glass. Rainy season making the gutters sing in low throaty tones, dry season rubbing its hot fingers over every wall until even paint seemed to sigh. Through them all, Evelyn found a rhythm, like a drumbeat under a song you don't consciously hear, but your body keeps time to. Daniel's work at the wharf remained unpredictable. Some weeks he came home with pockets so light they barely moved the fabric of his trousers. Other times he brought fish or plantains or small gifts for the girls. Martha started attending a small school run by a church woman who had more patience than chairs in her classroom, and Ruth grew like a plant in good soil, laughing easily, quick to climb anything that could be climbed. Yet Evelyn could not shake the sense that her family was a cloth missing a hidden pattern, that somewhere far away another pair of hands was touching something that belonged to her. She tried once to ask Daniel whether they might look for Clara, but his face closed like a window against rain. "You know how people move in this country," he said, shaking his head. "One day they're here, next day they're in Port Harcourt, or even across the border. And we don't have the money to chase shadows." That ended the conversation, but not the wondering. When she walked through the bustling market, she found herself scanning the faces of young girls selling groundnuts, roasted corn, or sachet water, searching for something she couldn't name. An echo, a flicker, a heartbeat in the shape of a smile. Nights brought dreams in which she saw both twins playing together in the same room, each reaching for the other's wrist as if drawn by the small crescent marks they both bore. She would wake with the image pressed into her mind like a thumbprint in wax, the feeling clinging to her skin, even after she washed her face at the clay basin in the yard. Sometimes, after Daniel had fallen asleep, she would step outside into the narrow street, stand under the quiet lamp light, and let the warm night air settle over her like a shawl. She would think of Nsukka and its mango trees, and wonder if Grace ever climbed anywhere she was. The first letter she wrote to Clara was an act of both courage and desperation. She had no address, only the memory of a narrow road in ABA, where Clara had once taken her after a stillbirth in another family, the smell of burning wood and frying akra heavy in the air that day. Evelyn sent the letter to a woman she knew in ABA who sold fabrics. She described Clara's face, her habit of wrapping her head in plain, pale cloth, the limp in her right foot from an old injury. Weeks later, the fabric seller replied, "I asked. Nobody knows her now. Maybe she moved to a wherry. Or maybe." The letter trailed off into the unsaid, a blank space that seemed louder than words. It was then Evelyn began to understand that some searches are rivers that run underground. You might walk over them for years and never hear the sound of water. She kept the letter folded in the bottom of her box of wrappers, under the purple one Daniel had bought her for their 5th anniversary. Life pressed forward regardless. Martha brought home songs from school and taught them to Ruth, who sang them off-key but with such joy that even Daniel laughed. Evelyn kept working, washing other people's clothes until her fingers were soft as boiled yam, selling roasted corn until the smoke settled into her hair like a permanent perfume. Yet on certain afternoons, usually when the wind came from the east, carrying smells from far-off towns, her chest would tighten without warning. She would close her eyes and see Grace, not as a baby now, but as a young girl with eyes like Ruth's, walking along a market row with a basket balanced on her head, a line of determination in her jaw that no hunger could erase. She would open her eyes to the same cracked walls, the same narrow street, but for a few moments she would feel as though she had stood in two places at once. Then came the year that rewrote their fortunes, though it began without ceremony, just another dawn over the rooftops of Onitsha, roosters crowing as though paid by the hour, the smell of wet earth from the night's brief rain. Daniel returned from a trip to Lagos with news that a trader there was looking for reliable men to transport goods regularly along the coast. The pay, though modest, was steady, and he had been chosen. Steady meant more than money. It meant not having to decide between rent and food, between school fees and medicine. It meant buying kerosene without calculating the exact number of cooking hours it would last. Evelyn began selling more roasted corn and added akra to her small stall. She wore brighter wrappers, not for show but because color now felt affordable. Ruth started school alongside Martha, and their laughter in the evenings filled the house like a drum rhythm you could dance to. But even as comfort crept in, bringing its quiet relief, Evelyn found her thoughts returning to the girl she had let go. Now that she was no longer measuring every grain of rice, the absence felt sharper, like a toothache that flares once the numbness wears off. She imagined that somewhere, perhaps in ABA or a Wary, Grace was also growing, also learning songs, also discovering which foods she liked best. One night, lying beside Daniel after the girls had slept, Evelyn asked again, "Do you think we'll ever see her?" His answer was a long sigh. "If the wind brings her back, we will know." "But you can't chase the wind, Evelyn. You just wait for it to change." She turned to face the ceiling, watching the shadow of the curtain sway in the faint breeze, and wondered how long a woman could wait before the waiting itself became another kind of loss. The air in Enugu had a different weight when Evelyn's family moved there. It carried the smell of coal dust and baked earth, the kind of scent that clung to your skin like an uninvited memory. The move had not been planned for long. Daniel's steady Lagos job had introduced him to a merchant in Enugu, who offered him a supervisory position in a warehouse that handled imported textiles. It was work under a roof, away from the salt-sore winds of the coast, and that alone seemed like a promise worth chasing. They rented a modest two-room house with a small veranda, where the girls could sit in the evenings to shell groundnuts or plait each other's hair. The neighborhood was alive in the evenings, men playing drafts with the same intensity some bring to war, women returning from the market with baskets balanced high, children tracing dusty circles with sticks and tires. For Evelyn, the move was both a relief and a fresh weight. She had traded the chaos of Onitsha for a quieter place, but quiet often meant more time to think. On some afternoons, she would walk the narrow lanes leading to the market, not to buy but to watch, stall after stall of cloth, fruits, pepper piles as red as coals, smoked fish stacked like crooked towers. Her eyes searched not just the goods, but the faces, each stranger a possibility her mind tried to stretch into grace. It became a habit she didn't confess to Daniel, memorizing jawlines, noticing the tilt of heads, wondering about birthmarks hidden under sleeves. The search had become less of an act and more of a reflex, like blinking against bright sunlight. Ruth and Martha adapted quickly to their new school, learning Igbo songs and English rhymes, carrying homework like precious cargo. They played with the neighbors' children, who introduced them to new games, some of which Evelyn remembered from her own childhood in Nsukka. Daniel, though busier, seemed lighter. His work was not glamorous, but it was predictable, and predictability is its own kind of wealth. Yet Evelyn sometimes caught him looking at the girls with a shadow in his eyes, as if he too was measuring them against the space left behind. Still, neither of them spoke of Grace. The name hovered in the unspoken space between them, like a bird they were afraid to startle. As months turned to years, life in Enugu settled into a rhythm so steady it almost felt permanent. Evelyn expanded her small trade, buying roasted groundnuts from the wholesalers and repackaging them for sale along with akra at a busy roadside corner. She found she had a knack for knowing when to call out to a passing customer and when to let the smell of frying beans do the work. The profit wasn't huge, but it was enough to handle her own expenses without dipping into Daniel's wages, which gave her a measure of pride. With this small independence, She started setting aside a little money in a tin she kept hidden under a stack of folded wrappers. She told herself it was for emergencies, but in truth, she was saving in case a lead about Grace ever appeared, money for travel, for questions, for whatever might be needed. This quiet hope was her private ritual, and it kept her company during the long hours of frying and selling. The market women nearby came to know her as dependable, someone who would watch their stalls if they needed to run errands. They also knew, though they never said it aloud, that her eyes were always scanning, that she paid more attention to the faces of young girls than most people did. Sometimes, a particular tilt of a head, the shape of a mouth, would make her pulse jump, but up close the illusion would break, leaving her with a strange mixture of disappointment and relief. She told herself that not finding Grace was better than finding her in bad circumstances, but that comfort was paper thin. Daniel worked hard at the warehouse, sometimes bringing home small pieces of leftover fabric for Evelyn to sew into dresses for the girls. On weekends, the family would go to the park in the city center, eating roasted corn while watching other families stroll by. Those moments were sweet but also bittersweet for Evelyn. She would catch herself wondering if somewhere in Enugu, or elsewhere, Grace was doing the same, her laughter carried away by the same evening breeze. The change began with a rumor that drifted into Evelyn's stall one morning like a scrap of paper caught in the wind. A woman who often bought Accra from her mentioned, in passing, a market vendor in ABA, who was young but carried herself with the seriousness of someone much older, someone who was known for her neat stitching and unusual crescent-shaped birthmark. The words jolted through Evelyn like the first sip of strong palm wine, unexpected and impossible to ignore. She asked careful questions, trying not to reveal too much. How old was the girl? Who raised her? Did she sell every day? But the answers were vague, wrapped in the uncertainty of hearsay. Still, that night she took out her tin of savings and counted the notes, each one worn from the hands it had passed through. She didn't tell Daniel immediately. She knew the conversation would be a stone to push uphill. Instead, she lay awake long after the girls had gone to bed, replaying the woman's description until it became sharper than the sound of crickets outside. In her mind, she saw Grace standing behind a market stall, fingers quick over a needle and thread, the birthmark catching the light when she reached for fabric. She tried to temper her excitement, reminding herself that birthmarks were not unique, that the girl could be anyone. But hope is a stubborn vine. Once it finds a crack, it grows whether you feed it or not. Over the next week, she asked more questions, sometimes directly, sometimes by weaving them into casual market chatter. Each fragment of information was tucked away like a bead in a growing necklace. She told herself she would go to ABA, just to see, just to know, but the thought of what she might find, whether it was joy or disappointment, made her stomach tighten. She began to notice every little similarity between Ruth and the imagined girl. The slope of their brows, the way they both tilted their heads when listening. It was dangerous, she knew, to build a person from scraps of rumor, but it was more dangerous to do nothing at all. When she finally told Daniel, it was on a Sunday evening, after the girls had gone to bed, and the house was wrapped in that particular stillness that comes only when children are sleeping. She spoke without preamble, the way you might confess to eating the last piece of meat from the pot, quickly, before you could change your mind. At first, he didn't respond. He sat with his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. Then he sighed, the kind of sigh that empties more than just lungs. ABA is far, Evelyn, he said quietly. And what if it's not her? What if you go there and come back with nothing but a hole in your chest? She told him she would rather have a hole from knowing than one from wondering forever. They argued softly, the way people argue when they are both tired and afraid, until he finally agreed to give her 2 weeks to prepare for the trip. In the days that followed, she worked longer hours, saving every extra naira she could. She repaired her best wrapper and blouse, telling herself she needed to look presentable, though she knew appearances would matter little if she did find Grace. On the morning she was to leave, Daniel handed her a small bag with bread, groundnut, and a flask of water, along with a folded note of money she hadn't asked for. For the road, he said simply. The journey ahead felt like walking toward a fork in the path where one road led back to her old life, and the other to something she could not yet imagine. As she stepped out into the early light, the air still cool, she thought of Nsukka, Onitsha, and now Enugu, a trail of cities like beads on the string of her life, and wondered if ABA would be the bead that changed the whole pattern. The road to ABA unwound beneath the morning sun like a long ribbon, frayed at the edges where the earth pressed too close to the tarmac. The bus Evelyn boarded smelled of warm plastic and petrol, the air thick with a faint scent of roasted plantain that someone had tucked away for the journey. She sat by the window, the tinny hum of the engine vibrating through the seat, and watched villages slip past, each one marked by the sight of women pounding yam in open courtyards, children chasing each other barefoot, and men gathered under the sparse shade of mango trees, their eyes following the bus as though weighing its passengers. Her mind moved between hope and fear in uneven steps. One moment she was sure she would see Grace that day, the next she imagined herself returning with nothing but the echo of disappointment. The road bent and dipped, sometimes so narrow it seemed the bush would swallow it entirely, then opening to wide stretches where the sun fell hard on the ground, bleaching the colors of houses and drying up the puddles from last night's rain. Traders with trays of boiled groundnuts and sachet water called through the bus windows at brief stops, their voices threading through the loud debates of the driver and conductor about fuel prices and road repairs. Evelyn barely heard them. Her mind was a drum beating to one rhythm. Find her, find her, find her. She clutched the bag on her lap, inside which the saved notes were folded tight, along with the letter she had written in case she found herself in a position to explain who she was and why she had come. As they neared ABA, the air thickened with the smell of dye and fabric starch from the markets that sprawled like a living river through the streets. The bus swerved and rattled to its final stop, and Evelyn stepped down, her sandals pressing into the heat of the ground. The market roared around her, hawkers singing prices, fabrics flapping in the wind like restless flags, the hiss of hot oil from street-side frying pans. For a moment she stood still, letting her senses gather themselves. She had entered a place where every corner seemed to hold 100 stories, and she needed to find just one. Her plan was simple, though it felt fragile in the face of the market's chaos. Walk slowly, let her eyes do the work, and follow any thread that pulled at her memory. She started down a narrow path between stalls, where bolts of fabric leaned against each other in colorful towers, and women bent over sewing machines worked with the focus of people who could measure time by the number of stitches made. Her heart thudded whenever she caught sight of a young woman, her gaze darting to their wrists in search of that pale crescent. But most wrists she saw bore only the marks of bracelets, bangles, or sun-darkened skin. Once she thought she saw it, a faint curve of lighter skin just above a hand, but when the girl turned, her face was too unlike Ruth's to keep the hope alive. Still she pressed on, weaving through the market's inner lanes, where the smell of dried fish mingled with the metallic tang of new sewing needles and the sweetness of ripe pawpaw piled high on wooden tables. At a small corner, an older woman selling thread and buttons noticed her hesitation and asked if she was looking for someone. Evelyn's voice almost failed her, but she managed to describe Grace, the birthmark, the age, the skill with sewing. The woman shook her head, but pointed further down, toward a cluster of stalls where younger vendors worked. Evelyn moved in that direction, the sound of fabric being shaken out filling her ears. And then, halfway down the row, she saw her, bent slightly over a table, trimming loose threads from a newly sewn purse. The girl's face was partly hidden by a loose scarf, but the tilt of her head, the careful way her hands moved, made something inside Evelyn's chest lift and ache all at once. She drew closer, the world around her softening into background noise. The girl looked up briefly to greet a customer, and in that small movement, the scarf slipped from her wrist. The birthmark was there, faint but clear, a pale crescent against her skin, as if the moon had left its fingerprint. Evelyn stopped breathing for a heartbeat, then stepped forward. It was not in Evelyn's nature to speak rashly, yet when she found herself at the girl's stall, the words that left her mouth seemed to belong to some deeper instinct. She asked the price of the purse, her voice steadier than she felt, and watched the girl's eyes, dark, steady, with a glint that seemed to recognize something unspoken. Grace named the price without hesitation, her tone polite but businesslike, the way one speaks to strangers. Evelyn bought it without bargaining, her fingers brushing the girl's as she handed over the money. The contact was brief, but enough to send a small shiver up her arm. She forced herself to speak casually, asking if the girl had made the purse herself, where she learned to sew, whether she sold here every day. Grace answered simply. She had learned from Mama Clara, she worked here most days, and she enjoyed the craft. The name landed between them like a dropped coin, small, yet impossible to ignore. Evelyn swallowed, nodding as though it were nothing, but her heart was a hammer in her chest. She asked if she might return another day to buy more, and Grace smiled politely, saying she would be there most afternoons. Evelyn walked away, clutching the purse as though it might disappear, her legs unsteady beneath her. She found a quiet corner near a stall selling smoked meat and sat, letting the noise of the market wash over her while her thoughts raced. She had found her, she was almost certain, but certainty was not yet enough. She would have to return, again and again, until the connection could be drawn in lines clear enough for everyone to see. For now, she needed to hold the moment close, let it settle into her bones before she acted. Back in Enugu, Evelyn told no one, not Daniel, not Martha, not Ruth. She carried the secret like an ember, feeding it quietly with the small air of her private thoughts. She returned to ABA twice more over the next month, each time finding Grace at her stall, each time asking a few more questions, each time letting her eyes memorize another detail. The slight arch of her brows, the way her smile tilted more on one side, the rhythm of her speech. Grace never seemed suspicious, only mildly curious about why this older woman kept returning to buy purses she didn't really need. On the third visit, Evelyn mentioned her daughters in passing, and Grace laughed softly, saying Mama Clara always teased her about being as stubborn as two people in one body. The words made Evelyn's eyes sting, but she hid it behind a small smile. She left the market that day knowing she could not keep the secret much longer. One afternoon, when Martha returned from school, Evelyn called her into the small back room and handed her the purse she had bought from Grace. "Look at this," she said casually, watching her daughter's reaction. Martha admired the stitching, then paused, her eyes catching on the small birthmark she saw in the photograph Evelyn had tucked into the purse's lining. "Mama," she said slowly, "this girl, her wrist, it's like mine." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. In that moment, she knew the path ahead could no longer be delayed. The sisters would meet, and whatever followed would unfold in its own time, under the same sun that had marked them both. The day Evelyn decided to bring Martha to ABA was one of those mornings where the air felt both heavy and expectant, as though the city itself knew something important was about to happen. She had told Martha they were going to buy special fabric for new Sunday dresses, a reason that would explain both the journey and the urgency without stirring too much curiosity. On the bus ride there, Martha leaned her head against the window, watching the road unspool in long stretches of dusty tarmac and scattered towns. Evelyn sat beside her, hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the passing scenery without really seeing it. Inside her, thoughts twisted like the threads on the market women's spindles, excitement, fear, doubt, hope, all turning over one another in a restless spin. She imagined the moment of meeting, playing it out in her mind in a dozen different ways. Grace's surprise, Martha's reaction, the recognition that might pass between them like a spark finding dry grass. Yet she also feared the possibility that nothing might happen at all, that they would stand face to face and see nothing familiar. She had not told Daniel about this trip, partly because she did not want his doubts weighing on her, and partly because some choices have to be carried alone until they either bloom or wither. When the bus finally rolled into ABA, the air seemed thicker, fuller of sound, the jangle of metal, the rise and fall of traders' calls, the slap of feet on the pavement. Evelyn took Martha's hand, guiding her through the crowd with practiced ease, the way a mother steers a child through a river's current. Each turn of the path brought them closer to the stall she had memorized like a prayer, and with each step Evelyn felt the space inside her narrow until it was filled entirely with the moment to come. Grace was at her stall, bent over a strip of fabric she was trimming, her brow furrowed in concentration. The sight made Evelyn's breath catch. This image was no longer built from fragments of memory or rumor. It was whole and present, here in the noisy heart of ABA. She steered Martha closer, her hand warm against the girl's back, guiding her to stand just in front of the table. Grace looked up, her gaze moving first to Martha, then to Evelyn, and something unreadable flickered in her eyes. Evelyn greeted her with the ease she had practiced, asking after her sewing, and whether she had sold many pieces that day. Grace answered politely, her voice calm but carrying that same grounded tone Evelyn had noticed before, as though she measured her words before letting them leave her lips. Martha, meanwhile, was studying the stall with curiosity, running her fingers lightly over the purses and small cloth bags neatly arranged. Evelyn waited for the right moment, her pulse loud in her ears. It came when Grace reached for a piece of fabric, and the sleeve of her blouse slid back. Martha's eyes caught on the pale curve of the birthmark, and she froze. Her gaze darted to her own wrist, then back to Grace's, and Evelyn saw the dawning realization begin to shape itself in her daughter's expression. The market seemed to fade around them, the chatter and footsteps becoming a muted hum. "Your hand," Martha said softly, almost to herself. Grace looked down at her wrist, then back at Martha, a small frown of confusion knitting her brow. Evelyn's voice, when it came, was gentle but steady. "Martha, this is Grace." She let the name hang there, heavy with meaning neither girl yet fully grasped. The next moments unfolded slowly, as if time itself had decided to step aside and let them find their own pace. Martha glanced at Evelyn, searching her mother's face for answers, while Grace continued to look between the two of them, suspicion and curiosity warring in her eyes. Evelyn knew the market was not the place for long explanations, too many ears, too much noise, but she also knew she could not simply walk away now. She asked Grace if she might join them for a short meal, gesturing toward a nearby stall where a woman served steaming bowls of pepper soup. Grace hesitated, glancing toward the older woman in the stall next to hers, who nodded with a small smile, as if encouraging her to go. They walked together, Martha beside Grace, their steps unconsciously finding a shared rhythm. At the table, Evelyn let the girls sit opposite each other, watching the way they studied one another in small, quick glances. There were similarities, of course, the line of the jaw, the arch of the brows, but it was in their eyes that the mirror truly showed itself. It was a quiet recognition, the kind that blooms slowly and deeply, without the need for words. Over the meal, Evelyn asked Grace about her life with Mama Clara, about her work at the stall, about her childhood memories. Grace answered each question with a mix of pride and reserve, clearly loyal to the woman who had raised her. Martha listened intently, her expression softening with each answer, as if the puzzle pieces were arranging themselves in her mind. When they finished eating, Evelyn walked them back toward the stall, promising Grace she would return soon. As they parted, Martha's fingers brushed Grace's in an almost unconscious gesture, and neither girl pulled away. On the journey back to Enugu, Martha was quieter than usual, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, but her thoughts far from it. Evelyn didn't press her. She knew the mind needed space to sort through discoveries of this kind. When they reached home, Martha lingered in the doorway before entering, glancing once more at the street as though half expecting to see Grace there. That night, after Ruth had gone to bed, Martha came to sit beside Evelyn, her voice low. "Mama, she feels like me. Not just looks, feels." Evelyn nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of joy and the ache of years lost. She told Martha the truth then in simple, careful words, explaining the choice she had made, the reasons behind it, and the years she had spent searching. Martha listened without interruption, her hands clasped in her lap, her face unreadable in the dim light. When Evelyn finished, Martha leaned against her, a silent acceptance that needed no more words. She said only one thing before standing to leave. "We have to bring her home." Evelyn watched her go, the echo of those words settling deep inside her. She knew it would not be simple. Life never offered back what it had taken without asking something in return. But the first bridge had been built, and she would see it crossed. The night outside was warm, the air carrying the faint scent of rain to come, and Evelyn sat alone for a while, holding both the weight and the lightness of what had begun. When Evelyn returned to ABA the following week, it was not with hesitation but with a certainty that sat firm in her chest, as though the path ahead had already been drawn and she had only to follow it. She had spoken to Daniel the night before, telling him everything from the moment she first spotted the birthmark in the market to the quiet meeting over pepper soup. His first reaction was silence, his gaze steady but unreadable. Then he rose from his seat and walked to the window, the light from the lantern casting his shadow long against the wall. He asked her if she was sure, if this girl was indeed the child she had given up in those hard days when choice was a knife with no handle. Evelyn told him that some recognitions do not need proof. They are as certain as knowing your own voice in the dark. In the morning, he pressed a few extra notes into her hand without saying much, the gesture both reluctant and resigned. The road to ABA was the same as before, but this time the air smelled different, sharper, as if the city knew it was being asked to return something it had been keeping. She found Grace at her stall again, the same calm concentration in her movements, the same light in her eyes when she looked up. But when Evelyn greeted her and asked if she could meet Mama Clara, the girl's expression shifted. Wariness flickered there, the kind that comes from protecting something fragile. Evelyn explained gently that she only wanted to thank the woman who had raised her so well, to see her face and speak with her. Grace hesitated, then nodded, suggesting they go after the market slowed. The hours until then stretched like long shadows, but Evelyn waited, her patience wrapped tight around her. When at last they left the noise of the market behind, weaving through quieter streets lined with weathered houses, Evelyn's heart beat with an old rhythm, one that had been with her since the day she handed her child into another woman's arms. Mama Clara's home sat at the end of a narrow lane, where the ground was worn smooth by years of footsteps. The small building leaned slightly to one side, its tin roof patched in places with whatever could be found, the walls bearing the stains of countless rainy seasons. Grace pushed the door open without knocking, calling softly for her mother. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dried herbs and old wood. A thin figure rose from a low chair by the window, her back bent, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the scarf on her head. When her eyes found Evelyn, there was no shock, no confusion, only a deep, steady gaze that seemed to travel backward through time. Evelyn stepped forward and greeted her quietly, her voice roughened by all the unsaid words. Clara gestured for her to sit, and for a moment the room held only the sound of birds calling from somewhere outside. Evelyn began slowly, thanking her for what she had done all those years ago, for raising Grace with such care and giving her the life Evelyn could not. Clara's lips curved into a faint smile that was both weary and warm. She told Evelyn that Grace had been a joy from the first day, that she had brought light into a house that had known too much stillness. Yet there was no bitterness in her tone, only a simple acceptance of the path life had taken. Grace sat between them, looking from one woman to the other, her brow furrowed as though she were trying to read a language she had only just discovered. Evelyn reached for her hand and held it gently, feeling the pulse beat there like a small drum. She told Grace the truth then, each sentence careful but unflinching, laying out the history of that night, the hunger, the fear, the choice that had never stopped living inside her. Grace listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from surprise to quiet contemplation. When Evelyn finished, there was a long pause before Grace leaned forward and said softly, "You came back." It was not a question, not an accusation, just a statement, as if naming the fact was enough. The days that followed became a slow weaving together of lives that had long been separate. Evelyn visited often, sometimes bringing Martha or Ruth, sometimes coming alone to sit with Clara and share tea. Martha and Grace began to speak more easily with each meeting, their initial caution giving way to the kind of familiarity that feels less learned than remembered. They discovered small similarities. Both disliked the taste of bitter leaf, both laughed with the same quick burst when surprised, both tilted their heads slightly when listening closely. Daniel came once, standing quietly in the corner of Clara's modest sitting room as introductions were made. He spoke little, but when he did, it was to thank Clara for her years of care. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden sweeping away of the years lost. Instead, there was a steady, patient mending, each thread pulled through with care. Evelyn noticed that Grace began visiting their home in Enugu, sometimes staying for a few days at a time. Ruth, after an initial shyness, warmed to her quickly, as though recognizing something unspoken. The three girls would sit in the courtyard shelling groundnuts, their laughter rising into the air like the sound of bells in the wind. On one such evening, Evelyn stood at the doorway watching them, feeling a sense of fullness she had not known for years. Clara's health, however, was visibly declining. Her steps grew slower, her hands weaker, but she seemed content, her eyes often following Grace with a kind of peaceful pride. Evelyn began to insist that she come to stay with them in Enugu, promising that she would be cared for and surrounded by family. Clara resisted at first, not wanting to be a burden, but finally agreed when Grace asked her with quiet persistence. The move to Enugu marked a quiet turning point. Clara settled into the small room Evelyn had prepared, a space near the back of the house where the light came in softly through a single window. She spent her mornings sitting outside, watching the neighborhood children play, sometimes calling them over to tell short stories or offer a sweet from the tin she kept by her bed. Grace now divided her time between her market stall in ABA and her family in Enugu, making the journey often enough that it began to feel routine. Evelyn noticed how naturally she fit into the rhythm of their home, helping with chores, laughing with her sisters, sitting with Clara in the evenings. Daniel, though still reserved, had begun to accept her presence without the quiet tension that had marked their early interactions. There was a day, some weeks after Clara's arrival, when the entire family sat together in the courtyard shelling maize. The air was warm, the light golden, and the sound of their voices blended into a kind of music that Evelyn wished she could keep in a jar. She looked at each of them, Martha with her steady gaze, Ruth with her restless energy, Grace with her quiet strength, and Clara with her watchful eyes, and felt something settle in her. The years apart could not be erased, but they could be met with the years ahead, filled with shared meals, laughter, and the slow, deliberate work of belonging. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Evelyn sat alone in the courtyard, the scent of night flowers drifting on the breeze. She thought of the girl she had let go, the woman she had found, and the family they had all become. The moon hung low, a pale crescent, and she smiled at the thought that somewhere, somehow, it had always been marking them. In life, we may lose touch with people, dreams, or opportunities, but time has a way of leading us back to what truly belongs to us. Never stop searching for what matters, but also never stop building with what's already in your hands. Love may bend under the weight of hard choices, but it does not break when it is true. Hold your loved ones close, because the heart always remembers its own. May your life be filled with reunions sweeter than your separations. May every door that was once shut against you open wide with joy. May God turn your silent tears into loud laughter. May the things you thought were lost find their way back to you, whole and beautiful. May your family be surrounded by peace that no trouble can disturb, and love that no time can weaken. May your days be long, your blessings abundant, and your heart forever warm. And may you always find light, even in the darkest paths, in Jesus' name. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.